My name is Naomi Ferris. I was 27 when I signed the papers for a small blue house on Larkspur Street, and I told no one. Not my mother, who called every Sunday at exactly 6. Not my father, who still introduced me at family dinners as the one who does numbers for a living, as though my job title were a coin he liked to flip and never spend. Not even my older brother, Dean, who I loved the way you love a storm you grew up sheltering from carefully and from a distance. I had been saving since I was 22. Small, invisible sacrifices. Coffee made at home. A 5-year-old car I refused to replace. A version of myself that looked, from the outside, like someone who wasn't going anywhere. I let them believe that. It was easier than explaining a dream I wasn't ready to defend. The house wasn't much, a narrow 2-bedroom with a crooked porch step and a lemon tree the previous owner said would eventually behave. But when I stood in the empty living room for the first time, keys warm in my palm, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The sensation of a door closing softly behind me, on my own terms. I didn't buy it to escape my family. I want to be honest about that because the story that follows might make it seem otherwise. I bought it because for the first time in my adult life, I wanted something to belong to me completely. No shared ownership of the outcome, no committee of opinions about whether it was wise. I planned to tell them once the boxes were unpacked. Once the walls had a coat of paint I'd chosen myself. I imagined my mother's hands pressed to her mouth, my father's rare, crooked smile. I imagined pride. I did not imagine what I found instead. It started with a forwarded email. My cousin Priya, who has never once in her life been able to keep a secret longer than a weekend, sent me a message meant for someone else. Did you see what Aunt Carol and Uncle Ray are planning for Naomi's inheritance money? Dean's really going to take the restaurant loan. And beneath it, a thread, one I wasn't supposed to see, stretching back 3 weeks. I read it standing in my new, empty kitchen, the lemon tree outside catching the last orange light of evening. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less painful. They hadn't known about the house yet. That wasn't the betrayal. The betrayal was older than that, and it had nothing to do with the house at all. The restaurant had been failing for over a year. I knew that much. Everyone did, though no one said it plainly. Dean had poured himself into it the way our father once had, inheriting not just the business, but the particular blindness that came with loving something too long to see it clearly. What I hadn't known was the plan forming quietly around me, like weather gathering behind a hill. My parents had been telling relatives, carefully, selectively, that I would naturally be the one to help. Not asked. Assumed. There was a life insurance payout from my grandmother, split 3 ways in her will. Mine held in a modest account I'd never touched because I didn't need it, and because touching it felt like touching her. In the thread, my mother had written, Naomi doesn't have anyone depending on her. She can afford to wait a few years before buying anything. Dean has a family to think about. A family to think about. As though I were a line item that could be deferred. There was more. A message from my father, 3 days before I signed my closing documents on Larkspur Street. We'll talk to her together. She'll understand once we explain it properly. She's always been reasonable. Reasonable. I sat with that word for a long time. I realized, the word they used whenever they needed me to be smaller than I was. I did not cry, not that night. I felt something quieter than grief, a kind of internal stillness, like a held breath. I thought about all the years I'd been the reliable one, the one who didn't ask for much, who filled the spaces between everyone else's needs without being asked to. I had built a life around being easy to love in that particular, convenient way. And somewhere along the line, easy had become invisible. I closed my laptop. I walked through the empty rooms of my new house, running my palm along the cool plaster walls, and I asked myself the question that would follow me through everything that came after. Do I confront this with anger, or do I finally learn to be seen? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew I wasn't going to hand over my grandmother's money or my new front door key without them understanding exactly what they'd almost taken from me without asking. For 2 weeks, I said nothing. I went to work. I painted the second bedroom a pale, uncertain green. I answered my mother's Sunday calls with the same even voice I always used, and when she asked, offhand, whether I was still saving up for something someday, I said yes, someday, and let the lie sit between us like a held door. People imagine silence as passivity. It isn't. Silence, held on purpose, is one of the heaviest things a person can carry. Every Sunday call became a small performance of normalcy stretched over something that had already cracked. I rehearsed sentences in the shower that I never said out loud. I drafted, then deleted, a text to Dean 4 separate times. I want to tell you I was purely strategic in that silence, that I was gathering myself like a general before a campaign. The truth is messier. Some nights I sat on my unfurnished living room floor and cried the way you cry when you're grieving something that hasn't technically been lost yet, grieving the version of my family I had let myself believe in. Other nights, I was simply angry, in the dull, low-grade way that doesn't burn hot enough to say anything, only hot enough to keep you awake. My Aunt Carol, not the one in the email thread, my father's younger sister, the one who'd left home at 19 and never fully returned to the family's orbit, called me on a Tuesday, out of nowhere. She said she'd heard I bought a place. Priya, predictably, hadn't managed to keep that quiet either. You didn't tell your parents, Carol said. It wasn't a question.
No.
She was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? When I left at 19, everyone said I was selfish. It took me 20 years to understand that wanting something for yourself isn't the same as taking something from someone else. Your family has a way of making those two things sound identical. I hadn't asked for that particular truth, but I needed it more than I realized. Something in my chest loosened, just slightly. Not resolution, but the first indication that the story I was living wasn't the only story available to me. That night, I finally answered the question that had waited 2 weeks in the quiet. I would not confront them with the anger that had been building. I would give them the chance to tell me themselves first. Whether they took it would tell me everything I needed to know. I invited myself to Sunday dinner, which I never did. My mother sounded pleased on the phone, a little surprised, the way you sound when something ordinary happens to align with something you've been quietly hoping for. I didn't tell her why. The house smelled the way it always had. Rosemary, old wood, the particular mustiness of a home that had absorbed 40 years of the same family's arguments and apologies. Dean was already there when I arrived, looking thinner than I remembered, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man trying to hold a business together with his bare hands. We ate. We talked about nothing. Priya's new job, the neighbor's dog, my father's blood pressure. I let the ordinary rhythm of it lull the room into comfort, and then, over dessert, I asked the question I'd been carrying for 2 weeks like a stone in my pocket. How's the restaurant? Something shifted in the air. My father set down his fork with unusual care. My mother's eyes flicked, just once, toward Dean, then back to her plate. We're managing, Dean said. Too quickly. Are you? I kept my voice gentle, curious, not accusing. Because I heard you might need help. Alone, maybe. The silence that followed had texture to it. My mother's hands went still in her lap. My father cleared his throat the way he did before saying something he'd rehearsed.
We were going to talk to you about it, he said.
Properly. We didn't want to spring it on you. When were you going to spring it on me? Naomi. My mother's voice had the practiced softness she used when she wanted a conversation to end gently, on her terms. It's family. We help each other. You've always understood that. I do understand that, I said. I've understood it my whole life, actually. I just didn't realize understanding it meant I wasn't allowed to have plans of my own that came first. My father frowned. What plans? I set my own fork down. I bought a house. 3 weeks ago. I closed on it the same week you two were deciding, without asking me, that my inheritance from Grandma Ruth should go to the restaurant, because I was, what was the word, reasonable, and didn't have anyone depending on me. The color left my mother's face slowly, like a tide pulling back to reveal what had been hidden beneath it. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Dean looked between our parents and me with an expression I hadn't seen on him since we were children, the particular helplessness of someone realizing a floor he'd trusted wasn't solid. You've been planning this without asking me, I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me. You decided what I could afford to wait for, what I didn't need, what I'd be reasonable about. all without once asking what I actually wanted. And I only found out because of an email I wasn't supposed to see. "We were going to include you," my father said, but the words had no weight behind them. Even he seemed to hear it. Include me in a decision that was already made. I looked at my mother. "You told Aunt Rena I didn't have anyone depending on me. Do you know how that sounds? Like my life only counts as real once someone else is attached to it." My mother's eyes were wet now, though whether from shame or from being caught, I genuinely couldn't tell, and that uncertainty was its own kind of answer. "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered. "Maybe not. But you meant it enough to write it down." Dean pushed his chair back and stood, pacing to the window, his back to all of us. "I never asked them to do this," he said, quiet. "I didn't know they were going to use your money. I swear, Naomi, I didn't know." I believed him. That was, oddly, the part that hurt the least. Dean's exhaustion had never been aimed at me. It was our parents who had quietly decided, without consulting either of their adult children, how our lives should be redistributed to hold up a business that was, in truth, already failing for reasons no loan could fix. "I'm not angry that you needed help," I said finally, looking at Dean, then at my parents. "I'm angry that you decided my life was the flexible one, the one that could be rearranged without asking. I've spent my whole life being the daughter who didn't need anything because it was easier for everyone if I stayed that way. I'm done staying that way." I stood. I didn't slam the door on my way out, though some smaller, younger version of me wanted to. I simply left the way I'd have wanted someone to leave a room they no longer felt safe in, quietly and completely. I didn't speak to my parents for 6 weeks. In that time, I finished the house. I hung curtains. I planted rosemary by the door, an echo of the smell I'd grown up with, chosen this time on my own terms rather than inherited. The lemon tree, against all its previous owner's warnings, began to behave, small green fruit appearing along its branches like a quiet vote of confidence. Dean called twice. The first time, he apologized for something that wasn't fully his to apologize for, and I told him so gently. The second time, he asked if he could see the house. I said yes. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, looking around at the pale green bedroom, the mismatched furniture I'd collected slowly and deliberately, the framed photograph of our grandmother on the mantel, the one from whom the disputed inheritance had come, smiling in black and white, unaware she'd become the center of a fight she never would have wanted. "It's good," he said finally. "It looks like you. That's the idea." He sat at my kitchen table and told me, without my asking, the real state of the restaurant. Numbers far worse than I'd realized, decisions made out of loyalty rather than sense, our father's stubborn refusal to consider closing even as the losses compounded. I listened. I didn't offer money. I offered something else instead. I helped him build a spreadsheet, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work I actually knew how to do, mapping out what an honest win-down might look like instead of a debt that would follow him for a decade. It wasn't the reconciliation my parents wanted. It was the one Dean and I built ourselves, on our own terms, at my kitchen table, under light I had chosen. My mother came to the house alone, on a Thursday evening in late autumn, without calling first. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. She stood on the crooked porch step, looking older than I remembered, or maybe just more honest, stripped, for once, of the composure she wore like armor at every Sunday dinner. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me, "about being the reasonable one." I let her in. We sat in the living room I had painted myself, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. "When I was your age," she said finally, "I wanted things too. A shop of my own, actually. Nobody remembers that now, not even me most days. I let it go because it seemed impossible, and then it seemed pointless, and then I told myself I never wanted it in the first place. I think," she paused, her hands twisting in her lap, "I think I did to you what was done to me. I decided your dreams were more affordable to postpone than his. I didn't even notice I was doing it. That's the worst part." I didn't forgive her in that moment, not entirely. Forgiveness, I was learning, isn't a door that opens all at once. But something in me softened toward the shape of her honesty, if not yet toward everything it excused. I don't need you to fix it tonight, I told her. I need you to actually see me, not the reasonable version.
Me.
She nodded and cried quietly, and I let her, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence between us didn't feel like something either of us was performing. It's spring now. The lemon tree on Larkspur Street has its first real fruit, small and sour and entirely mine. My parents didn't get my inheritance, and the restaurant closed quietly in February, without the theatrical collapse everyone had feared. Dean works for a logistics company now, steadier hours, a paycheck that doesn't depend on whether strangers choose his restaurant over another. He comes for dinner sometimes, and we don't talk about what almost happened because we don't need to anymore. The spreadsheet sits, unused, in a drawer, a small monument to the version of help I chose to give instead of the one that was assumed of me. My mother and I are rebuilding something slower and more honest than what came before. Not the easy performance of Sunday calls, but something with more silence in it and more truth. My father struggles more. Some people find it harder to meet their own reflection than others do, but he came to see the house last month, stood in the doorway the way Dean once had, and said, quietly, "You did this yourself." "Yes," I said. "I did." I think often about the version of me who almost told her parents about this house with open hands and no armor, expecting only pride. I don't resent her. She just hadn't yet learned what I know now, that being loved and being useful are not the same thing, and that a life doesn't have to be defended loudly to be defended completely. The lemon tree sheds a little more fruit every week, more than I know what to do with. I've started leaving baskets of it on the porch step for neighbors, a small, ordinary generosity that costs me nothing and asks for nothing back. It feels different from the generosity I used to give, the kind that was quietly expected, assumed, taken as a given feature of my character rather than a choice. This is a choice. All of it. The walls, the rosemary, the slow rebuilding with my mother, the boundary I finally learned to hold with my father. All of it, mine, chosen, and no longer up for a vote I wasn't invited to. Some evenings, when the light comes low and gold through the kitchen window, I stand where I stood the first night I read that email, and I think, this is what it feels like to finally be seen, not as reasonable, not as easy, but as someone whose life was never meant to be a line item in someone else's plan. The porch step is still crooked. I've decided I like it that way.